You're standing in the bustling heart of ancient Rome, the Forum, a place of power, commerce, and spectacle. But on this particular day, the air is thick with a different kind of energy, a tense, whispered fascination. The emperor, Nero, is here, surrounded by his Praetorian Guard, but it's not his imperial might that captures the crowd's attention. It's the figure at his side, a stunning, regal-looking woman, draped in silks and jewels, who bears an almost supernatural resemblance to Nero's beloved, late wife, Poppaea Sabina. But the horrifying truth, whispered from citizen to citizen, is that the emperor's new wife was once a teenage boy named Sporus, and what Nero did to him is a story that reveals the darkest corners of human obsession and the ultimate tragedy of absolute power. This isn't just another lurid tale of Roman excess. It's a deep dive into the psychological horror of a man who tried to bend reality itself to fit his madness, and the forgotten boy who became a living doll, a walking ghost of a dead empress. Before we explore this haunting story, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden, human truths behind history's grand narratives, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's truly incredible that we can connect across time and space to share these stories. The story of Sporus is fundamentally the story of what happens when a man can never be told no. It begins not with a monster, but with a promise. The emperor's golden age and its decay. When Nero ascended to the throne at just 16 years old, the Roman people had reason to hope. Under the guidance of his tutor, the philosopher Seneca, Nero's early reign was marked by reduced taxes, a crackdown on corruption, and lavish public games that endeared him to the common people. He saw himself as a visionary artist, a performer, a poet, not just a politician, and his early years were, by all accounts, a promising dawn for the empire. But absolute power is an insidious poison. For a man who never had to face a single contradiction, every whim became law. The isolation of the imperial palace, the constant paranoia of a court filled with rivals, and the overwhelming weight of being the single most powerful person on earth began to erode his sanity. By 65 AD, Nero wasn't just a leader, he was a god in his own mind, and his world had become a stage where he was both the star and the playwright. And the one person he believed was worthy of sharing that stage was a woman named Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea was not a woman to be overlooked. When Nero's first wife, Octavia, was quiet and dutiful, Poppaea was a force of nature. She was breathtakingly beautiful, but also shrewd, politically ambitious, and unafraid to challenge the emperor. Their affair was a scandal that rocked Rome, but for Nero, it quickly became a consuming obsession. He didn't just want her, he needed to possess her completely, to the exclusion of all else. He divorced Octavia, a move that enraged many, and married Poppaea in a ceremony of unprecedented luxury, lavishing her with gifts and elevating her to a position of immense power. He saw her not as a partner, but as an extension of his own glory. Ancient historians describe how Nero would spend hours just watching her, commissioning countless portraits and sculptures, and isolating her from any rival influence. It was the behavior of a collector, not a lover. Poppaea, for her part, was clever enough to play this dangerous game, using her influence to build her own power base. But she had a fatal flaw. She refused to be a simple possession, a fit of rage, and a final obsession. The details of what happened on that fateful day in 65 AD vary slightly, but the outcome is always the same. In the midst of a heated domestic argument, some say over Nero's late-night chariot racing, others about his theatrical pursuits, the emperor lost control. Poppaea, who was pregnant with their second child, dared to stand up to him, criticizing his priorities and questioning his judgment. For a man who had not been contradicted in years, this was an unforgivable offense. In a blind rage, Nero struck her, not with a slap or a punch, but, according to the historian Tacitus, with a brutal kick or blow to her abdomen. The attack was so violent that it caused fatal injuries. Poppaea died within hours, taking with her their unborn child. Imagine the moment the red haze of his rage cleared. Nero, the man who commanded an empire of millions, had just destroyed the one thing he claimed to love more than anything. His grief was not just an emotional breakdown, it was a total rejection of reality. He refused to have Poppaea's body cremated, an ancient Roman custom, and instead had it elaborately embalmed and placed in a tomb, declaring her a goddess. He would talk to her corpse for hours, a man so powerful he believed he could command life itself. The court was forced to participate in this macabre fiction, leaving her seat empty at banquets and referring to her as if she were still alive. It was in this chaotic, grief-stricken, and utterly deranged world that a young man named Sporus first caught the emperor's eye. The creation of a living doll. Sporus was a young freedman in the imperial palace, likely no more than 15 years old. He was a slave who had been granted his freedom, a position of some privilege but complete dependence on his master's goodwill. His life was, for all intents and purposes, entirely in the hands of the emperor, but it wasn't his administrative skills or his loyalty that attracted Nero's attention. Ancient sources agree that Sporus bore a striking, almost uncanny, resemblance to the late Empress Poppaea, especially in his eyes and the delicate structure of his face. In Nero's broken mind, this was not a coincidence. This was a second chance, a way to undo the irreversible. Here was an opportunity to bring back his lost love, to replace the woman he had destroyed. The problem, of course, was that Sporus was a boy. But for a man who had spent months talking to a corpse, a surgical gender transformation seemed like a minor detail. What followed was a systematic act of psychological and physical cruelty that remains one of the most disturbing chapters in ancient history. Nero summoned the best physicians in Rome and commanded them to perform surgery on Sporus, not for any medical reason, but purely to make him appear more feminine. This was an incredibly dangerous, painful, and often fatal procedure in ancient times, and it was done not for health, but for artifice. Sporus was unmade. His original identity was methodically stripped away, day by day, piece by piece. Once he had recovered from the brutal surgery, Nero gave him a new name, Sabina, after the dead empress. He was moved to special quarters, where a team of imperial staff worked tirelessly to complete his transformation. Imperial seamstresses created a new wardrobe, designing gowns to fit and flatter his modified physique. Master jewelers crafted new ornaments, many of which incorporated gems that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. Each piece of jewelry was a shackle, a physical reminder of the person he was being forced to replace. Makeup artists and hairdressers taught him how to soften his features with cosmetics, how to style his hair in elaborate feminine coiffures, and how to carry himself as a Roman noblewoman. Tutors were assigned to him to correct his posture, modify his gait, and even alter his speech patterns, forcing him to speak in a higher, more delicate tone. This wasn't just about changing his appearance. It was a complete and total erasure of the person he was. Every time Sporus looked in a mirror, he saw a stranger's reflection. Every lesson in feminine behavior was a dagger to his own identity. For Nero, it was a creative project, a grand performance to reconstruct his lost love. For Sporus, it was a living nightmare, the final act of a tragedy. The culmination of this horrific process was a full imperial wedding ceremony in the spring of 67 AD. Nero spared no expense. He treated it as a legitimate marriage, complete with traditional vows, joining of hands, and the signing of legal documents. Here was the most powerful man on earth, publicly marrying a surgically modified teenage boy dressed as his dead wife, and forcing the entire Roman elite to play along. For 2 years, Sporus was forced to live this double life. He was expected to accompany Nero to public functions, to sit beside him at state dinners, and to respond to the emperor's insane ramblings about their shared past as if he genuinely remembered. The psychological strain must have been unimaginable. But Sporus became a master of this deadly performance, developing an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Nero's moods. In public, he was the devoted wife, the returned empress. In private, we can only imagine the terror and isolation he must have felt. By 68 AD, the emperor's excesses had finally pushed the empire past its breaking point. Rebellions erupted, the Praetorian Guard abandoned him, and the Senate declared him a public enemy. When Nero was finally forced to flee Rome, Sporus was among the small group of loyalists who went with him. Even in his final moments, Nero could not bear to be without his living reminder of Poppaea. Nero's story ended in a pathetic, theatrical suicide, but for Sporus, the nightmare was just beginning. He became a political prize, passed from one powerful man to another, each new emperor treating him exactly as and madness. Tacitus, a more sober and critical historian, also mentions the affair, though with less lurid detail. He treats it as part of a larger pattern of Nero's moral decay, using it as an example of the emperor's shameful exhibitions and his total disregard for Roman tradition. Cassius Dio, writing much later, in the 3rd century AD, echoes the earlier accounts, reinforcing the narrative of Nero's depravity. These accounts, while providing us with the only glimpse into Sporus's life, are not without bias. They were all written by men who despised Nero and the era of tyranny he represented. The story of Sporus was a perfect weapon for them, a powerful and visceral symbol of Nero's crimes against nature, tradition, and even the very concept of humanity. It's important to remember that while the facts of the story are well attested, the interpretation, the outrage, and moral condemnation is filtered through the lens of Roman aristocratic values. The theatre of Nero's life. The Sporus episode was, in many ways, the ultimate expression of Nero's twisted worldview. For him, life was a performance, and he was the star. He saw himself as a great artist, a poet, a musician, and a charioteer, but unlike other performers, he could control every aspect of his stage. He didn't just act in plays, he forced senators and aristocrats to watch and applaud his mediocre performances. He didn't just write poetry, he had it inscribed in gold and displayed in public. The creation of Sporus was the climax of this artistic megalomania. It was a play, a ritual, and a piece of living art all in one. Nero was not just a grieving widower, he was a playwright, a director, and a set designer, and Sporus was the lead actor forced to play a ghost. He wasn't just seeking to replace Poppaea, he was seeking to stage her resurrection, to prove that his power was so absolute that he could even cheat death and bend reality to his will. This wasn't just bizarre, it was the ultimate expression of a life lived without consequence. For a man who could order the death of his own mother and his first wife, the physical and psychological destruction of a young slave boy was not an act of cruelty, but a creative endeavor. Sporus was a testament to Nero's power to not only dominate others, but to remake them in his own image and to fit his own fantasy, a legacy of tyranny and a final act of dignity. Ultimately, the story of Sporus became a fundamental part of Nero's enduring legacy. When later Roman historians, and even the general public, looked back on the emperor's reign, they didn't just remember his financial mismanagement or his purges of the Senate. They remembered the boy who was forced to be an empress. This story cemented Nero's reputation as a perverted monster for centuries, a tyrant whose madness transcended politics and touched on something far more primal and disturbing. But in the shadow of this imperial horror show, Sporus's final act stands out as a singular moment of self-reclamation. Throughout his life, he was an object, a prop, a doll, a symbol. He was defined entirely by his resemblance to someone else, and his existence was a grotesque reflection of another person's grief and power. His suicide was not a moment of weakness, but a final, powerful refusal to be used, degraded, and defined by others. In his death, he finally shed the silks, the jewels, and the name Sabina, and for a brief, tragic moment, became Sporus once more. His story reminds us that history is not just a list of names and dates, but a collection of profoundly human experiences. Behind the grand statues and magnificent palaces of Rome, there were countless personal tragedies, and few are as haunting as the boy who was forced to become an empress, and whose only real choice was to choose death over further humiliation. What does the story of Sporus tell us about the power of memory and the way we use history to shape our understanding of heroes and villains? While the story of Sporus is a grim lesson in imperial power, it also holds a mirror up to Roman society itself, revealing the deeply ingrained fears and values that made Nero's actions so uniquely shocking. To truly understand the full weight of this tragedy, we have to look beyond the individual emperor and consider the cultural context that made a story like this so infamous. Let's delve into what this event tells us about Roman society and its enduring legacy, Roman masculinity and the assault on identity. Roman culture was built on a foundation of virilitas, a concept that encompassed not just physical strength but also moral virtue, courage, and most importantly, the ability to dominate. A Roman man was expected to be a master of his household and his own emotions. Any display of effeminacy or a perceived loss of control was seen as a profound weakness. The Roman elite were particularly sensitive about their dignitas, a sense of personal worth and respect that was constantly on public display. Nero's actions against Sporus were a calculated and shocking assault on these very values. By forcing a young male to undergo surgery, wear women's clothing, and adopt feminine mannerisms, Nero wasn't just indulging a personal fantasy. He was publicly violating the core principles of Roman identity. He took a person who was born male and, in a ceremony witnessed by the most powerful people in the empire, officially declared him to be a woman. In doing so, he showed a complete disregard for Roman traditions, social norms, and the sanctity of the human body. This is why the story was such a powerful tool for Nero's enemies. It wasn't just a scandal, it was proof that the emperor had lost his way entirely, that he had become a corrupting force that could destroy the very definition of a Roman man. The spectacle of Sporus, paraded as an empress, was a living embodiment of Nero's complete and total tyranny. A final thought on a forgotten boy. In the end, the story of Sporus is a haunting reminder that behind every monumental historical narrative, the rise and fall of emperors, the grandeur of ancient empires, the brutal reality of conquest, there are countless personal stories of suffering and resilience that have been lost to time. We know almost nothing about who Sporus was before he met Nero, and the details we do have are filtered through the biased accounts of men who saw him only as a symbol of Nero's depravity. Yet, in that final, tragic act of taking his own life, Sporus made a choice that had been denied to him for years. In a world where he was a pawn, a doll, and a grotesque echo of a dead woman, he found one final moment of agency. He refused to be a spectacle for the mob, to be a final piece of Nero's bizarre theater. His suicide was not a sign of weakness, but an act of defiance so profound that it resonates even today. His story is a testament to the enduring human spirit and a stark warning about the corrupting nature of unchecked power. It reminds us that the most important lessons of history are often found not in the triumphs of the powerful, but in the quiet tragedies of the powerless. So, as you walk through the world today, what forgotten stories or unseen struggles can you recognize in the grand narratives around you?